Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be back at Sophia University, speaking again here in Tokyo. And I want to thank especially Okabe Sensei and her colleagues for the gracious invitation. And I want to talk to you today about the broad issue of human displacement and forced migration and the challenges that this crisis presents for states and for the international community. Okay, advance the slides here. So just to start the presentation, I want to draw your attention to a few books that have been published recently, and much of my lecture today will be drawn from this book in particular, which just was published by Stanford University Press in the spring of this year. It's entitled Understanding Global Migration. So some of the things that I will be discussing are covered in this book. Okabe Sensei mentioned another book, which is now in its fourth edition, called Controlling Immigration, now a comparative perspective, and Okabe Sensei has some commentaries in this book on Japan and the European Union. Finally, I just want to mention one more book, which many of you, I'm sure, in the audience are familiar with. This is a book also in its fourth edition called Migration Theory, which is a sort of how-to book for those studying migration. It covers the migration theory across the social science disciplines, including history and law. Here is my agenda for today's lecture, and I will try to get through as much of this as I possibly can in the time that is allotted to me, which is about half an hour. First, I want to share with you something about the historical perspective and the global context for the current humanitarian crises, the crises of displacement and forced migration. I want to talk specifically about the challenge of forced migration, how states are responding to this challenge, and also, of course, how the international community is responding. Time permitting, I will say a few things about Ukraine, which is, as you know, a historic displacement crisis. We now are in the midst of a new imperial war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, something we have not seen since the Second World War, this kind of conflict, which has produced millions of displaced people and refugees. Finally, I will say a few words about the issue of migration and global governance, a topic about which I have written extensively. So first, let's look quickly at the numbers here, get some context and some perspective on the current crises. As you can see from this map, you might be a bit surprised to see that the largest number of migrants, that is people who are living outside of their country of birth for 1 year or more, it's actually the European region. And of course, this number has grown exponentially or very fast as a result of the Ukrainian crisis. Second is Asia, also a region of tremendous migration. So I think it may come as a bit of a surprise that North America, for example, only comes into third place in terms of the number of migrants in the different regions of the globe. Just very quickly, why are the numbers up? Well, to give you perspective, the global population since 1985 has grown by 60% from 4.9 to 7.8 billion. Whereas international migration has grown by 150%, moving from 111 million to close to 300 million today. The reason migration is increasing is because of demographic and economic inequalities. I think you all are familiar with this between the richer and the poorer countries. And we have witnessed many revolutions in the past decades, revolutions in communication in particular, transport, And I also want to very much stress the importance of rights, the rise of what I call rights-based politics. And 20% of the global migrants are in two countries, Canada and the United States, which have only 5% of the global population. So still, North America, Canada, and the US are principal destinations for migrants. And of course, we have seen a very rapid rise in forced migration in what is called the global South, where many people are driven out of their countries by conflict, climate change, and other disasters. So here you can see very quickly how the numbers are changing. And it's important to look at the green line here, the trend, where the purple line, where south-south migration is increasing actually faster than south-north migration. So when we look at forced migration, I'll come back to this in a moment, fully 86% of the people who are displaced, forced migrants, are located in the global South. So the South is where most of the forced migration is taking place. I will not spend a lot of time on this, but I do want you to understand that historically migration is more the rule. In human history, people have always moved. It's not until the advent of the nation state, this is just basic international relations, and the Westphalian system, which ties people to specific territorial units, and war and conflict become major causes of migration. From the 17th to the 19th century, a lot of migration is unfree. We understand so many people were forced to move because of slavery. But even during this period, the borders remained relatively open. It's in the 20th century where we have wars and genocides that lead to the closure of states, the hardening of what I call the Westphalian system, especially in the interwar period. And finally, after World War II, we see a humanitarian turn in migration with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, excuse me, and the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees, which was amended in 1967 by the protocol. So let's look at the challenge of forced migration, human displacement. Why do people move? Well, they move first and foremost for economic reasons, because of the demand pull forces and supply push forces, and also because of the networks that develop, the family ties, the social capital that ties families together. This is what really increases the number of migrants in the past decades. But these are the necessary conditions for international migration. The sufficient conditions for migration are actually legal and political. But just remember, under international law, all states have the right to control the entry of people, if not the exit of people. But to have a right to exit without any concomitant right to enter, it's a pretty hollow right. So, and under international law, we have a sharp distinction between voluntary and forced migration. So with the 1951 Geneva Convention of Refugees and the 67 Protocol set up a principle of a well-founded fear of persecution in order to claim asylum, and the principle of non-refoulement, which means you cannot be sent back to a country if you are fleeing persecution in that country. Here is just a quick chart that shows you the rise in the number of persons of concern for UNHCR. And the numbers, as you'll see in a moment, have actually surpassed 100 million people. It's important to look at the green region of these numbers, and you can see that over half of the people of concern are actually internally displaced people. So internal displacement is actually the biggest single challenge today. Here you can see what I just mentioned, the continuing increase in the number of forcibly displaced people, rising from about 43 million in 2012 to over 100 million today. So the numbers are going up. So if you break down these numbers, it's about 100 million people, which is 1% of the global population, which doesn't sound like a lot of people, but the humanitarian crises are concentrated, as we know, in specific regions. This includes 21 million people who are refugees, about 22%, 4.4 million asylum seekers. So the number of asylum seekers is actually much lower. It's only about 5% of this population. But as I mentioned, 50% of the people who are concerned to the UNHCR are actually internally displaced people, 49 million to be exact. We have a new category of people of concern in the Americas. I think the numbers have actually gone up in recent times to closer to 6 million Venezuelans who have fled their country. And also 4.4 million stateless people and 6.5 million others, including the Ukrainians, who now make up about 7% of the people of concern. And as I mentioned, 86% of these forced migrants are concentrated in the global south. Here you can just see very quickly the evolution of these numbers, and you can see the blue line here, which shows you the very rapid increase in people who are internally displaced, refugees being far behind, asylum seekers actually much further down in the numbers. So just to stress again, the prominence of internally displaced people. The other organization which counts internally displaced is the IDMC, which estimates there are 55 million people across 149 countries at the end of 2020. And this does not count the Venezuelans or the Ukrainians. So out of these, 48 million are displaced because of conflict and violence, 7 million as a result of natural disasters, compounded by climate change. 20 million IDPs are minors and children. 2.6 million of these people are over 65. So you can see the numbers are increasing. One of my colleagues at Oxford, Alexander Betts, refers to many of these people as survival migrants. So if you don't move, then you will perish. You cannot survive. Here, if you look at the refugees by country of residence, it's important to note that Turkey is by far the largest country hosting forced migrants, followed by Pakistan, Lebanon, and so forth. So this just gives you an idea of where these people are concentrated. This is in 2015. If you look at the most recent estimate, Turkey is still number one, but you can see that Colombia, for example, has now moved up to second place, followed by Uganda, Pakistan, and Germany, of course, is in there as well. And even tiny Lebanon and the poor country of Bangladesh are also hosting very large numbers of forced migrants. And Lebanon, of course, is a tiny country, and about 1 in 4 people there are forced migrants. If you map the world's refugee population, I don't have time to go through all this in detail, but again, you can see the prominence of the Syrian migration. This does not display the Ukrainian displacement, but you can sort of see where the big crises are concentrated still in Afghanistan and South Asia, but also South Sudan, East Africa, Venezuela. So it's important to note here that the Central American crisis at the American southern border, it still does not make the top 10 crises, humanitarian crises in the world. So forced migration presents us with a legal conundrum. I think you will hear more about this from other colleagues during this session. But under international law, as we know, states have to distinguish between political and economic refugees. And this has to be done, should be done on a case-by-case basis, because each individual has to be assessed and analyzed based on their claim of well-founded fear of persecution. So in the Northern Hemisphere, this is done de jure on an individual basis, but in the Global South, refugee status is often de facto. And some states in the Global South host large refugee populations, and so they're taking people as a group, not just doing them individually. Here you can see the number of asylum seekers in the EU, which spiked in the middle of the 2010s. It has fallen off quite precipitously since then. I think I'm going to skip this slide and go straight to the refugee situation in the United States. This is actually an interesting chart which goes all the way back to 1975. It may be difficult for you to see the colors here, but of course, the last great refugee crisis in the United States came as far back as the 70s and 80s. This is with the collapse of South Vietnam, and Asia continued to dominate much of the movements of refugees into the United States. If you look at the current period, the refugee crisis still is not nearly as important as it was with the collapse of Vietnam, and also the South Vietnam, I should say, and also the end of the Cold War, which led to very large numbers of refugees coming to the United States. Here you can see refugee admissions, the numbers of persons, how it has gone down precipitously in the United States. Of course, the administration of Donald Trump tried to basically cut refugee admissions to zero, and you can see the effects of the Trump policy here. This is a very interesting chart. A lot of people have asked questions about what's going on at the southern US border. And the main takeaway from this chart is that in the recent years, we have seen a very large increase in the number of people coming from outside of the Western Hemisphere, or people who are coming not from Mexico and Central America, but now increasingly from Venezuela, even from places as far away as Bangladesh and Haiti. This shows the region of origin of forced migrants and refugees in the United States. And you can see how important Africa is, for example, in these numbers, along with South Asia and the Near East. And of course, the further you get into the Trump era, the smaller the numbers are. This shows you a breakdown of those who are coming in the United States, arriving at the southern border. And also you can see the prominence here of children, unaccompanied minors. That's the sharp increase that we see in the recent years. And this shows you monthly migrant apprehensions at the US-Mexico border. They are now going back up to where they were in 2019. We're talking 120,000 people plus who are coming to the southwest border of the United States and being apprehended there by Border Patrol. I'm going to skip over a few of these slides in the interest of time. I do want to say a few words to you about the complex politics of migration. And this is covered in detail in the books that I mentioned at the outset of this lecture. So let's look at how politics of migration works. It's very important to understand that migration is a multi-dimensional social phenomenon, which has, of course, big political overtones. And states are pulled in basically 4 different directions. I think this is very important, especially for a Japanese audience, to understand the multidimensionality of migration politics. In normal times, there's a trade-off between markets, that is to say the economic need for migrant and the status or the rights that are given to migrants. But in times of crisis, the security dimension becomes much bigger. And if you look at East Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, we can see that the security dimension tends to override very often the market dimension, whereas rights and status are not very well developed in the Asian region. The final point about the multidimensionality is when you get a cultural dynamic and the trade-off between markets, rights, security, and culture, which is another way of saying that often ethnicity, religion, race come into play in migration politics. This is just a simple slide to show you that there is a market dynamic to these migrants. These are a picture of young Italian men who are coming in large numbers to Germany to work as guest workers in the 1960s. And the German subtitle here says that for 60 marks, you can buy an Italian worker for 60 marks. There's a great quote here from a Swiss writer, a Swiss novelist, who said about the guest worker policies of the 1960s, In Europe, he said, we asked for workers, but people came instead. So this is often a much quoted phrase that shows you how guest worker programs, especially in liberal democracies, liberal societies, they don't work very well because you cannot reduce people to simple commodities. This is a picture of the German chancellor with a Syrian refugee in her famous expression in German, "Wir schaffen das," which means we can do this, we can handle these people. Over 1 million asylum seekers arrived in 2015, 2016. So this put enormous amounts of pressure on Germany in particular and on Europe. So this is a picture of a poster in Germany, which was promoting asylum for these people coming from the Middle East. And it says simply the biggest catastrophe in this is if Germans forget that they too themselves were once refugees. This picture here, to sort of conclude some of my discussion about the politics of migration, shows you that this is a four-dimensional game, the trade-offs that states are forced to make. And you can see that it's also a three-level game. So the politics is taking place not only at the national level, but also at the international level, and especially at the local level. So just remember that migration politics has four dimensions, and it happens on three different levels. So to go back to the problem of cooperation, we know that as migrants come in larger and larger numbers, states are often forced to make very difficult decisions about how to stop migrants from coming once the door has been opened. And we know that Germany and the European Union struck a deal with Turkey, for example, to send people back to Turkey. And we saw the same dynamic happening in North America as the Trump administration, pressured Mexico to become the policeman for the southern border of the United States. So this is a dynamic that's all too familiar to people who study migration, externalization, if you will, of border control, pushing border protection and migrant control to neighboring states. And we saw increasingly following the 2011 terrorist attacks in France and a series of attacks in Europe, we saw a further politicization of migration, a larger and larger security dynamic, culminating in the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States, which really politicized these issues. And we could ask the question, have we reached the end of this great liberal period, liberal interregnum, as I call it, that lasted from the end of World War II, really up into the 2010s. So have we reached a turning point here in world politics? This is just a picture of Trump giving a speech. Of course, he argued strongly that the U.S. should ban Muslims from coming to the U.S. and build a wall to keep migrants from crossing the southern border. So an example of the kind of populist politics that is going on throughout much of the Western world, but it's a politics that's largely absent in Japan, interestingly enough. Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. So just again, to keep the focus for a second on the United States, immigration to the United States is down 43% since 2016. A very, very large fall in the number of migrants, especially legal migrants, but also, as I mentioned, refugees. You can see here the fall in legal permanent migration, but also the fall in the number of refugees coming to the United States. Again, just a picture of one of the more famous populist politicians in France. This is Jean-Marie Le Pen, whose daughter, Marine Le Pen, was the runner-up candidate for the presidential election earlier this year in France. The quote here simply is from Le Pen, the father, saying that France should be for the French, and to be French, you have to earn the right to be French. Again, just more pictures about the cultural differences here. This is a young French girl protesting the banning on the wearing of the hijab and the chador in France, asking why can't she also have the right to be different. So again, just showing the cultural side of these debates. I think I don't have time really to get into this slide. I just want to again stress the point that the cultural, religious dimensions of these debates in France. This was a poster that was put out by the French Ministry of Education to promote the idea that laïcité, the secular French tradition, is what allows these children, to live together, to go to school together, to swim together, and so forth and so on. So you can see the very strong cultural dimension of the debate. Again, a picture here of the German neo-Nazis, skinheads, arguing that the foreigners should be kept out of Germany. This, of course, is a picture of the famous leader of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which became the Brexit Party. This is Monsieur Nigel Farage, with a good French name, a British politician who simply said, "I want my country back," which became a slogan for the Brexit campaign and the vote by Britain to leave the European Union. So again, to move very quickly through this, I know I only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go pretty fast. Let's turn our attention now to the war in Ukraine, where we have seen, as I said, a historic displacement of people, a humanitarian crisis that has not really been seen in Europe itself since the Second World War. And at the rate we're going, I'll show you the numbers in a second, the Ukrainian displacement is beginning to rival, it's looking more like the last great humanitarian crisis of this sort would be the partition of India, the breakup of India into India, East and West Pakistan, which resulted in the 1940s in the displacement of about over 20 million people. So we might even end up with numbers like that if the war continues in Ukraine. So this is the largest displacement in Europe since World War II. We're up to about 10 million people and counting. 3.5 million have fled the country. 6.7 million people are internally displaced. Obviously, these numbers are very fluid. This is a floating population. It is equivalent to the displacement of Germans after World War II. And just for the historians in the audience, of course, there's a very strong irredentist logic in this displacement. Irredentism refers to the desire on the part of states to recapture lost territory and to unify what they see as other ethnically compatible populations. The Germans, of course, did this in the 1940s. With the building of the Nazi state and the attempt to unify all the German-speaking people in Europe. And we see the same logic going on now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine to unify Ukraine and other Russian-speaking regions with the Russian homeland. So, and as I mentioned, this displacement is very comparable to the partition of India when you had over 20 million people displaced. No one knows the exact number, but it was somewhere over 20 million. So these latest numbers from Ukraine is a very fluid situation. And as of October 4th of this year, 7.6 million people had fled Ukraine. Poland, Romania, Germany, Russia itself. Of course, a lot of the Ukrainians who are being moved to Russia are being forcibly removed and displaced there. Many of the population in the Donbass and the eastern regions are being simply forcibly moved to Russia. Hungary, Moldova took a very large number, the tiny state of Moldova, Slovakia. To date, only about 30,000 Ukrainians have made it to the United States, whereas the largest Ukrainian diaspora, the largest Ukrainian population outside of Europe is in Canada, and the Canadians have taken already about 100,000 Ukrainians. Even several hundred of the Ukrainians have made it as far as Japan, as I'm sure many of you in the audience know. So again, just showing you where the concentrations are. Poland, obviously, a very big destination, Germany, and so forth within Europe. So Ukraine is definitely a humanitarian emergency with a very strong rights dimension to it. You could contrast the response to the Ukrainian crisis to the response of Europe in 2015-16 to the exodus of people from Syria, Afghanistan, coming from Muslim countries. These people were it was much more controversial. The Europeans, especially the East Europeans, did not want to take the Muslim asylum seekers, whereas all of these countries were very quick to open up their borders to the Ukrainians. The reason for this, there are two reasons for this. One is the Ukraine is part of Europe. It's in the neighborhood of Europe, and it's a strong attachments culturally to Europe, both in terms of religion and race. But there's also, don't forget, a strong security dynamic involved. Europe is now in a new war, essentially, with Russia. So far, it hasn't broken out to a war between NATO or the EU and Russia. It could get there. So there's a very big security dynamic to this, and a recognition that the Ukrainians need to be taken care of. It's also important to note that those fleeing so far, almost 80% of them are women and children, because the men are forced to remain to fight in Ukraine. And the EU implemented its temporary protective directive, which was first put into the laws in 2002. This is the first time the Europeans have done this. So to allow so many people to come in and have essentially a temporary protected status. And of course, as I said, this is a very gendered migration, with the men who are forced to stay and the women and children who are allowed to go. So there's a lot of family household dynamic at play here. How will all this displacement of Ukrainians play out? Well, much depends on the conflict itself. If it doesn't stabilize, many people will not be able to return. So we have to know how long the conflict is going to last, and we simply don't know that. So the prospects for return migration will depend on the duration of the conflict. And the Ukrainians, as I mentioned, are going in search of other Ukrainians where they have family members and ties. And it's important to look at the Ukrainian diaspora here. I would just note that there's been a lot of solidarity in the EU, both in Central and Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe, whereas the British have been much slower to admit the Ukrainians. I think this is clearly a related to the Brexit vote itself, which was to keep East Europeans from migrating in large numbers to Great Britain. So the British have been very slow in recognizing the Ukrainians. So the question is whether this European and international consensus will hold. How long will it last? I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. I just want to say a few words in conclusion now about the whole issue of migration and global governance. I know this symposium is devoted to the United Nations and UN Week, and we have many colleagues here who will be speaking about the UN, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. But when you think about migration and global governance, if we're looking at it at the global level, we're talking about a multilateral process. Of course, there's a lot of regionalism involved in migration governance. And one question, just for the international relations scholars in the audience, is whether you can make migration governance can be defined as a public good, that is to say, something that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So I just want you to think about this in a public good framework. So we've clearly seen in recent years the limits of migration governments, and we know that unilateral regulation of migration and the rollback of rights is something that clearly undermines the liberal order. We've seen this very powerfully in the United States, for example. You know, the trade-off between rights on the one hand and numbers and markets on the other. This is a very, very difficult trade-off in all liberal democracies and liberal societies. So one way to get around some of these dilemmas is to construct regional regimes, that is to say, to have more cooperation. And if you have enough symmetry in terms of interests, where you don't have large asymmetries, as we see in the EU, then it's possible to have migration defined, if not as a public good, then as a club good, and to have more cooperation in terms of the regulation of migration, especially asylum seeking and so forth. Unfortunately, this multilateral regional dynamic does tend to break down. We've seen this very powerfully, and it ends up often in suasion games, to use an international relations term, which means that states begin to put pressure on other states, linking certain issues to migration, to force neighboring states to become the policeman and to help with border control and border management. We've seen this very powerfully, for example, between the U.S. and Mexico, where President Trump threatened to cut off trade with Mexico if the Mexicans didn't stop the movement of Central Americans across Mexican territory. We also saw it, as I mentioned, in the dynamic with the EU and Turkey, where in this case, the Turks were able to ask for things from the European Union in exchange for stopping migration. So this is a very powerful dynamic that works against global governance and against regional governance migration. So again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide, but if you want to have regional or global governance, then there has to be some centralization of regulatory authority, as we have seen in the EU, so you can have the possibility of the harmonization of policies and the convergence of policies, and the need, I would say, for a dominant strategy. I'm sure my colleagues from the UN can talk about best practices. Don't forget the global compacts themselves. The global compacts, which were only put forward a few years ago by the United Nations, which are meant to guide the international community towards a regime, an international regime, which would be where migration would be legal and orderly. In the absence of this, of course, we're simply thrown back, if you will, on to the national migration state itself. So I think I will skip this in term just for to move to get to the end of my presentation. Skip this one as well. I'm not going to say much more about a public goods approach to migration, other than the fact that the object, which in this case is constructing an international migration regime, it must fulfill the criteria for multilateralism as defined by the late John Ruggie, which would be that the object of the regulation must take the form of a public good. There have to be norms of conduct principle around which the states, the actors, can converge. And of course, as those of you who have studied this know, there must be diffuse reciprocity and respect for the rules of the game. So the qualities of a public good versus the qualities of a club good. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail on this. I would just say that what we're talking about here is something much like a traffic light. You know, a traffic light is a perfect example of a public good. So to keep the benefits of the smooth flow of traffic, which are non-rivalrous in consumption, everyone benefits from the traffic light. You can't create a market to sell traffic safety to individuals or groups. So the benefits then are non-excludable. So what we're aiming for in the international community is the orderly legal movement of people, which can take the form of a public good. And we can avoid this dynamic of the weaponization of migration, using migrants as pawns, for example, in a geopolitical or strategic game in order to achieve some other purpose, in the way, for example, in Belarusians brought tens of thousands of migrants from the Middle East, sent them to the border of the EU, trying to help them get across in order to put pressure on the EU to drop the sanctions against Belarus and against Russia itself. So we see a lot of these kinds of games being played, which set us back in terms of migration, international migration governance. I'm going to conclude just by drawing your attention to this simple 2x2 graphic here, which shows that in spite of the increasing interdependence, migration interdependence, we see more and more people moving. Global migration governance remains relatively weak. If you look at international regimes and global governance, we can break them into 4 different categories here. One category would be the strongest category, for where we have the most multilateralism and the strongest institutions, which is in the area of finance and money. I'm referring here to the IMF and the World Bank, with strong multilateralism, strong institutions. If you drop down to the quadrant on the right-hand side, we can see that trade also has a very strong institutional basis to it. The multilateralism is, of course, weaker than what we see in finance. If you go to the top left quadrant, you can see that the strongest regime here for international migration, global migration governance, is still the refugee regime, and the idea political asylum, well-founded fear of persecution. So there's a clear principle here. There's a norm of conduct, which is the principle of non-refoulement. And the UNHCR is a perfect example of this strong kind of migration governance, where institutional, multilaterally, it's fairly strong. The institutions are perhaps weaker than what we see for finance and trade. And finally, in the bottom left corner, you can see that the weakest regime is really for labor migration, even though the ILO is a very old organization going back to the League of Nations. So the ILO is very active, but it still struggles to build a regime for labor migration. And the IOM is now part of the UN system itself. And the IOM, of course, plays a very important role in helping to manage the movements of people around the globe. So I wouldn't discount these regimes, but they still have a long way to go to be as strong as the refugee regime, not to mention the regime for finance. So Okabe-sensei, I think I will conclude on this note. I know I've gone maybe a little beyond my allotted time, but I hope I have at least raised some questions, and I look forward to your comments and discussions online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hollifield. Could you please stay there for a second? Yes, thank you very much for such a comprehensive and informative and I would say insightful presentations. We've learned a lot from your presentations. You know, literally you covered all of the almost areas in the world.
Yeah.
And you know, there are three basic points we think are important, highly important, is maybe it's time for us to think again about the relevance of refugee protection regime in a legal sense, which means that we tend to think that the international refugee law is a kind of a given, but in fact it's not. It was just a creation of the 1951 and 1967, and at the time, you know, there were much more, as you have shown us in your graphs, much more Europeans and maybe in the Asian and refugees and victims of international displacement than the other people. So the demographic change is happening, and also, you know, you highlight is how the migration issues can become a highly profiled one, which means that, you know, the politicians are becoming to talk more on migration issues, maybe in reaction to the mass media's broadcasting and all other public reaction to that. So this kind of intercourse is not happening in Japan, at least, and somewhere around the Asia. So that may be part of the reasons to explain why the Asian migration issues tends to be low profile, despite the fact the number is much larger.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be 2 points to respond quickly to you. You're absolutely right. The refugee asylum regime, which was put in place in 1951, don't forget, it only applied to Europe. So this was not a regime that had any bearing really on what was happening in other parts of the world. But with the crises and decolonization, you know, the creation of many new independent states, it was in the 1967 protocol that the refugee regime was then extended to other parts of the world. So one big point to remember is the major refugee and humanitarian crises in the 1940s and 50s. The reason this regime was created was because the crises were in Europe. And it was the Europeans and the Americans who came together to do this. And as I mentioned, the biggest crisis actually would happen in the Asian subcontinent with the partition of India, which created an enormous crisis. The second point that I wanted to make to you, which has now gone out of my head, unfortunately, but oh yes, to go back to Japan, you know, Japan has not been very strong in sharing the burden or responsibility for refugees. I'm sure many of you know, there were only a couple of occasions historically where the Japanese did play a role. They did during the Vietnamese crisis. They took some Vietnamese refugees, and today they are taking actually some Ukrainians, but again, very, very small numbers compared to what's going on in Europe or other parts of the globe. So those are just a couple of comments to get everybody thinking about what's happening in terms of global migration governance. As you yourself know, because you've written about this, if you look at what's going on in East Asia and Southeast Asia, the governance of migration in the Asian region, and most of the migrants are intra-Asian migrants. They're not coming from other parts of the world, but it tends to be largely bilateral. So you have a lot of bilateral agreements. There's no regional dynamic, nothing like what we see in Europe, or even to some extent in North America. And I would say also in South America, because don't forget, in South America, you also have Mercosur and, you know, a regional dynamic there. So Asia lags very far behind in terms of migration governance compared to other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you very much.